We are now all of a sudden at week 10 in our journey through the U.S. government. Up until now, we focused primarily on the federal government. Matter of fact, we've talked about very little else to this point. We've explored the Constitution. We have looked at how all three of the branches of the federal government work, how they are checked by one another, and what that means for you and me as U.S. citizens. Today we're going to focus on state governments. Of course, I don't think there's any need to tell you there are 50 states in the United States of America, and the states are fairly a unique idea. If you go to any other nation that has any amount of size to it, you will find that it's subdivided into, shires, counties, regions, prefectures, whatever they want to call it, just for the sake of, okay, here's a geographical area where we can put certain resources in to serve the people. Here's another one. That county or shire or prefecture doesn't have any special rights that the other ones do. They all are under the same government. Say in Japan, all of them are equal. None of them have a governing body in and of themselves. They might have somebody or a local commission that looks at resources locally, but they don't have any rights per se. United States is different in that as a part of the creation of this nation, it was explicitly expressed in the Constitution that these states would have certain rights. Now, we will talk a little bit here about how those rights sometimes conflict with the federal government and who wins that argument. But this nation was set up as a nation of states, United States. And unlike counties and other worlds, geographic regions, the states of the United States of America have very specific rights, and they have quite a bit of power. Matter of fact, because they are closer to the people they serve, in many respects, they are more consequential in your day-to-day life than is the federal government. Now, the federal government's stuff, their doings get most of the national coverage, obviously, but state government is of vital interest to us as we move about. State and local government in particular. They handle most directly the educational issues. They are in charge of road building, maintenance of roads, business operation, marriage license, and other matters that are directly pertinent to all of us. We have one national government and, of course, 50 state governments. That means 50 constitutions. Each state has one. 50 state legislatures, 50 chief executives or governors. Each state has its own unique arrangement for governing people and doing things. One thing we are seeing right now, as the presidential election is wrapping up and there are legal challenges being filed, we are seeing that these states, same states, they're different states but in the same nation, have very different ways of counting votes. Each state has their own system for collecting votes and tallying votes. And right now, if you didn't know it before, we are seeing that counting votes in Georgia and Pennsylvania is a different process. And that's good. If we had a national voting system and everyone had to follow a national set of guidelines, that's one thing. But this, oddly enough, because states are so different in the way they do things, it makes it very hard for someone to mess with it. Is very, very hard. No matter what President Trump says, it is exceedingly difficult, practically impossible to successfully hijack the American election because you got 50 different entities counting votes in 50 different ways. Very difficult. Part of the U.S. Constitution is that each state must have its own constitution. The earliest state constitutions came before the formation of the government. Again, the 13 colonies were set up as colonies. They were speculative ventures by people and business sponsors from England mainly, and they wanted to set up a colony in the New World and bring people over, make money, send it back to England, send resources back to England, whatnot. They were set up as kind of social business ventures. So long before this idea that we would be United States, each state had pretty much their own governing body. They had a governor. Not like the governor we have today. The governor was appointed by the royal court back in England. So you had royally appointed governors. A lot of these colonies formed with what was called charters. That was a long-winded way of saying, this is the Georgia colony, hereby King George III says, did it, or whatever. And when it came time to draw up a constitution, a lot of them simply cut and pasted the charters because they kind of served the same purpose. During this change from status as a colony to a state, and after the Civil War in particular, Congress required the 11 secession states to write up a brand new constitution that had to be checked as okay by the federal government before they could be allowed back into the United States. They had to remove, of course, all references to slavery, promise allegiance to the Union, and all that. But yeah, to be a state, you've got to have a constitution, and we have 50 of them. State constitutions, very, very similar to the U.S. Constitution. Most begin with a listing of the rights of the people. Think about the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. The big difference, though, is that state constitutions are much longer and much more detailed, and they have been rewritten a lot. There's no 2/3 House, 3/4 state legislature requirements, obviously, in the state constitution. They are amended all the time, and that is by design. Again, they're all subservient to the U.S. Constitution, so if there's ever a conflict, the Supremacy Clause, remember that from last week, says the U.S. Constitution is the one that's more important. But the state constitutions were set up to, again, affirm the rights of the people, but also to do the bulk of day-to-day activities. And day-to-day activities, sometimes mundane, don't require a complicated constitutional amendment or change process like the U.S. Constitution does. We changed the Constitution 2 weeks ago in Virginia when we voted in favor of the first question on the ballot to allow an independent commission to redraw lines. In order to get that on the books, we the people needed to pass that and change the Virginia Constitution. The average, the U.S. Constitution has about 4,500 words. With amendments, it totals about 7,800. The Alabama Constitution has 376,000 words. You get the idea. The state constitutions are not not governed by brevity. Let's put it that way. About 1/4 of the states wrote new constitutions after the Civil War. Another 1/4 wrote new constitutions after World War II. They basically just scrapped it, wrote it again. A lot of it's the same, and again, they can't go against the U.S. Constitution. Again, we talked about amendments. The U.S. Constitution has been amended 27 times. 10 of them were at once, so really 18 changes to the Constitution. California has amended its Constitution 500 times. Again, most of the changes are minor and grungy. California has a real reputation for changing the Constitution. Voters routinely have a dozen or more constitutional questions on the ballot in California. Alabama, with the 376,000-word Constitution, a lot of that gives the state of Alabama a lot of power, and the cities and counties of Alabama very little. Again, much like we talk about the difference between the federalism, the state versus national government battles, in Alabama, they are constantly having battles between local and state government, and that happens here. Danville City Council, the Pittsylvania County Board of Supervisors has, in the past, been very upset about rules and laws and regulations dictated to them by the state legislature in Richmond. So that check and balance, if you want to call it, that loggerheads, that battle is going to be continuing on and on. In 1962, voters in Georgia approved 132 constitutional amendments on the ballots. Wow. Some of them get a little carried away. The process involved, again, amending the Constitution varies from state to state, but none of it is as onerous as the process for changing the U.S. Constitution. The American people have to be involved in government at the state level, first to exercise our rights and freedoms in a way that really makes a difference, and second, to make sure that the state government, like the U.S. government, is doing what it's supposed to do, as in serving the people, and not us serving them. Let's take a look at state legislatures now. One of the criteria, constitutionally mandated criteria for a state to be a state, is they have to have a legislature. It has to be a representative legislature. It cannot be a legislature where a small cabal of people appoint the members. It has to be popularly voted on. They call it different things. Here in Virginia, it is the Virginia General Assembly. Some of them call them the General Court, Legislative Assembly. It's all the same thing, kind of the equivalent as Congress is to the federal government, the General Assembly is to the Virginia government. In here, the book kind of takes you, if you follow the book verbatim, it takes you through the machinations of setting up the state government in South Dakota, just as an example. I'm going to be filling you in from examples from Virginia. It's where you live, where I live, and it's obviously the state I am way, way more familiar with. In just about every state, not all of them, but state senators serve 4-year terms. Those who are in the lower chamber, called the House of Representatives in some cases, but the House of Delegates here in Virginia, serve 2 terms. So one difference, 2-year terms. So the difference is in U.S. Congress, 2 years in the House, 6 years in the Senate. Here in Virginia, 2 years in the House of Delegates, 4 years in the state Senate. There's no constitutional restriction or requirement on the number of representatives that have to be in a state's legislature. Virginia's totals are just about the national average. National average for a state senate is 39. We have 40. National average for a house is 108. We have 100. Pretty close to the average. New Hampshire has 400 people in their house. So if you're looking at them, a state of 1.3 million people, imagine this. If you were to extrapolate this ratio of House members to citizens, if you were to extrapolate that at the federal level, let me do some quick on-the-fly math here. Yeah, that's a Congress with 12,000 people in it. Makes you rethink how special it is to be a congressman, doesn't it? That's weird. But anyway, again, there's no constitutional limit on the number of seats in the state house. 15 of the 50 states have term limits. Nebraska has the only unicameral legislature. They don't have a House and Senate. They just have one governing body. Also of note, in Nebraska, these seats are run for without party affiliation. I mean, people are members of parties, but you don't run for them as a Democrat or Republican. You run for them as a citizen of Nebraska. So already you're starting to hear the parallels between these 50 state legislatures and Congress. They're all modeled after Congress, all modeled, of course, after Parliament in England. It's an approach that works in a representative form of government, and that's what we are using. Now, the organization of state legislative bodies are a little bit different. Each chamber has a presiding officer. Lieutenant governor is always the chair of the state senate, much like the vice president of the U.S. is the president of the Senate. All the legislatures have standing committees and whatnot of things, again, much like in Congress. If it's a bill having to do with growing something, it's going to the Agriculture Committee and all that jazzmatazz. The process by which a bill becomes a law in each state is generally the same as it is in Congress. If it starts in the House, it goes to a House committee. Committee says okay, sends it to the House floor. House approves it, sends it to the Senate. Senate sends it to their appropriate committee. They say okay, send it to the full Senate. They say okay. It goes to the governor's desk instead of the president's desk to be signed. Here in Virginia, the veto process is precisely the same as it is in Congress. If the governor vetoes a bill, it takes 2/3 of the House and Senate to override it, just like in Washington. No difference at all there. Despite all these similarities, and there are a lot, there are some key differences between state legislatures and Congress. State legislatures generally meet for a much shorter period. Congress meets more or less year-round, with some significant breaks. They'll get a month off here, 6 weeks off here, but a congressional session is 2 years. But it starts in January, ends in December. So there's around the clock, there's usually something going on. State legislatures generally meet for much shorter amounts of time. In Virginia, it's very short. Virginia has one of the shortest mandated sessions in all the nation. In even-numbered years, the Virginia General Assembly can meet for no more than 60 days. In odd-numbered years, they can meet for no more than 46 days. That's not a lot of time to get a whole lot of bills considered, thousands and thousands of them every year. And of course, the difference between odd and even numbered years is we run on a 2-year budget. So they give them the extra time, even numbered years, to do a budget. As a result, in Virginia, because you spend so little time in session, we have what is known as a citizen legislature. That is to say, these are citizens first and lawmakers second. Most of the time, these guys have their citizen hat on and not their General Assembly hat on. Most of the time, they are not in session. The idea is that a citizen legislature goes to the state capitol, passes laws, and then comes back and lives under the laws they pass. If you're a member of Congress and you live in a very far-flung state, you might spend 10 months out of the 12 months of the year in Washington. You have very, very little time as citizen such and such under the laws you pass. I'll kind of like our system a little better. We'll talk about that in class. The rule of a lawmaker. Is it a good thing that the lawmakers, in Virginia in particular, have to spend most of their time not in session? Now, again, when the Assembly's not in session, they do meet with their committees from time to time. They take fact-finding missions. Here in Danville, Danny Marshall, our delegate, was chair of the House Agriculture Committee for 6 years, I believe. And as a result, he was kind of busy even when he was not in session. Agriculture Committee will have little impromptu meetings all throughout Virginia to hear concerns from business groups, citizens, farmers, and whatnot. So yeah, but they're not in session. There is a true citizen legislature. As a result, most of the 140 members of the Virginia General Assembly have full-time jobs outside of politics. It's not like Senator Ted Cruz, who's number one source of income or source of time is being a member of Congress. Bernie Sanders is not a banker or lawyer or anything. He's a member of Congress because it's a full-time job. Here in Virginia, it's not a full-time job. The Supreme Court resolved two long-standing issues regarding election of state lawmakers in the 1960s. The issues involved reapportionment, that is to say, how a state is broken up to districts, geographical districts, where people represent in the state legislature. A lot of the fear was, and this has really, really been happening in Virginia for the past generation, that the urban areas were getting more people and therefore more power. I'm going to try to show you this right here, and I hope this comes out okay, because I'm trying to demonstrate the shift between rural Virginia and urban Virginia over the past generation. As you watch the years click off here, as we get closer to modern day, you'll see that shift from the mountains, the valleys of western Virginia, basically the other side of I-95, and see the population gaining in what we call the urban crescent, northern Virginia near D.C., the Richmond capital area, and far east the Tidewater area. That's where the vast majority of Virginians live today. 40 years ago, the rural Virginian representatives were the majority. Now, urban representatives are easily the majority. So you can see that rural Virginia is very scared about the numbers of the urban majority. They are worried that there's urban domination. Fortunately, there's enough infighting amongst the urban factions for resources that they haven't joined forces and basically made rural Virginia a serf yet. It could happen, though. And there is really nothing you can do in that respect. We can't be like the U.S. Congress and have a federalistic Senate. What are you going to do? Let every county have a representative? Well, if you want to try that, go ahead. But in some states, that would be very, very difficult. The Banker versus Carr decision in 1962, where the court reversed its position, that says in the past, I should say before that, the Supreme Court was very, very reluctant to get into redistricting stuff because redistricting is a very, very partisan political process. And judges, as a rule, and probably a good rule, they like to stay away from truly political controversies. But in 1962, in Baker versus Carr, they decided, yeah, this is getting pretty bad. So they, first off, assumed a judicial role in this controversy, And the court said that this kind of malapportionment was a violation of the U.S. Constitution's clause for equal protection under the law. 2 years later, in Reynolds versus Sims, a case that originated out of Alabama, under their reapportionment plan, each of Alabama's counties was to send one senator to the upper house, that idea we talked about here, even though some of the counties had 15,000 people and some of the others had 600,000. Supreme Court said that would be a violation of equal protection under the law. Now then, you say, well, in the U.S. Senate, California's got 10 quadrillion people, not really, and Wyoming has a few 100,000, yet they have the same 2 seats. Right. Why? Because the Constitution says so. Very, very specific. The Senate represents the states, the House represents the people. There is no constitutional provision for a state house to follow that. Therefore, the Supreme Court case says that efforts by the state to kind of duplicate the U.S. Senate is what they call maladjustment of the district lines. All states apportion both houses of their legislatures. Again, like we mentioned in Virginia a couple of weeks ago, we approved an idea to have an independent commission draw these lines every 10 years based off the census numbers. So next year, when the General Assembly gavels into session, an independent committee made up of allegedly equal Democrats and Republicans is going to meet together and redraw state lines, and it still has to be approved by the General Assembly, but in terms of drawing up, sending the proposal, it's going to be done by hopefully an impartial panel. Again, state government in many cases is where rubber meets the road. They have control over the roads, state taxation, inheritance, mortgages, corporations, operation of a state lottery, of course, state law enforcement, Virginia State Police for highway and interstate safety. States give out childhood vaccinations. There's a State Department of Health, which understandably has been very busy lately. So, yeah, at the state level, again, a lot of the same things that we see at the national level, although that 10th Amendment, if it's not specifically given to the federal government, it has to go to the states. We're still paying attention to that in some respects. There is a U.S. Department of Education, but federal education policy is very, very limited. Most education policy is done at the state level. The first governor in America began leading the Jamestown colony in 1607. As we mentioned, for a long time, the colonial governors were appointed by the king, or the king's court, basically, back in England. Now, with the United States in effect, each state has a governor. At one time, legislatures elected governors in most states. You can see where that is a really, really bad idea if you want to have any semblance of checks and balances. A governor who owes his or her position to the state legislature is not going to get into a fight or a disagreement with the state legislature. That's a very fundamental way to ensure a check and balance. Therefore, every state now popularly elects their governor. Their state legislature does not appoint them. The governor is basically the equivalent of the president, with obvious exceptions. They are the chief executive of a state. They head up the state bureaucracy, much like the president heads up federal bureaucracy, 4.5 million workers. Governors have to give a State of the State address, like the President's State of the Union. In most states, unlike in the federal government, the governor will prepare a budget that's presented to the legislature, and the legislature works from there. Very rarely do the legislatures accept the governor's budget. Democrat versus Republicans there, but they do it. Governors can veto legislation, like we said, and in some states, governors can exercise a line-item veto. You'll recall, U.S. Congress tried to do that in 1996, put it into place, and then the Supreme Court said, no, can't do that. They said that the president's authority in the Constitution was strictly limited to either signing a bill or vetoing it, not changing it. And a line-item veto is considered changing a bill. You either accept it or you drop it. State governors are under no such compunctions. As a matter of fact, under no such restrictions, I should say. In Virginia, there is a planned veto session for a few days, about 2 months after the regular legislative session ends, because every year, because of the power of veto of the governor of Virginia, he's going to veto several laws. He can change laws, too. If he doesn't like the way the wording is on one, or the length of time or a sentence or whatever, he can make changes to that. Same thing, it has to go back and be overridden by 2/3 of the House and the Senate in order for the governor's changes not to have effect. So in that case, the governor of Virginia has much more power over legislation than does the president over Congress. The governor's ex officio member of a lot of state boards and whatever. They also take a very active role in something that we'll be talking about here, business and tourism recruitment to the states. Much like the president is the sort of the de facto face of the federal government, a state's governor is the face of the state government. They can call out the National Guard. They have broad pardon powers, much like a U.S. president does. They can delay executions. The old trope with the guy on death row, he's not asking for a phone call from the president. He's asking for a phone call from the governor. It's the governor that has the authority to stop an execution. Governors serve 4-year terms in all but 2 states. Governor of Virginia is unique in that they can serve only 1 term. They cannot run for re-election. Usually have a very minimal residency requirement for governors, usually only 5 years of residence in the state. That's why Terry McAuliffe got elected. He, for many years, lived up north. In all but 6 states, there is a number 2 position of lieutenant governor. Much like the vice president has very few official duties in the U.S. Constitution, here in Virginia, the state duties for the Virginia lieutenant governor, very, very limited. They break ties in the Senate, which has happened several times, actually, recently. But most of the time, the lieutenant governor is the forgotten dude in Virginia politics. If you've ever seen the lieutenant governor's office in the Bell Tower in Richmond, you'd see why. It's not much of an office, folks. You're thinking, lieutenant governor, God, this must be nice. It's a broom closet, maybe, basically. Maybe a little bit larger, but not much more. Some governors, the lieutenant governor or the second-in-command duties fall to a secretary of state. In Virginia, we have a secretary of state, but they don't have that kind of power. Broadly checking, gubernatorial powers include control of the legislative sessions. We mentioned the veto power. They have very broad appointment powers. All of the state departments, that is Virginia state, not U.S. state, those are appointed by a governor. Again, much like the governor has veto or has the appointment power for federal bureaus, governors have broad authority in states at that level as well. And of course, quite often, governorship is a stepping stone to the presidency because if you think about it, a governorship is probably the only position that gives you really, really good training for the White House. You're doing a lot of the same things. Vetoing bills, trying to cobble together legislative majorities to get some of your bills passed. You're appointing department heads and whatnot. Very, very similar. Of course, the president has this cool military up under their control anyway, despite that. State bureaucracies are going to be more or less the same as the federal government with the obvious exceptions. There are military departments in Virginia, but of course the U.S. military department is bigger. And I've told you a lot about the state of Virginia. The 3 statewide offices that Virginians vote on every 4 years are governor, lieutenant governor, and attorney general. They don't run as a ticket. In some states, much like we do with president, you vote for the Republican president, vice president. Some states you vote for the Republican governor, lieutenant governor. Here in Virginia, we don't do that. So quite often in the past, we've had governors and lieutenant governors from different parties. Happens all the time. The 3rd statewide office we vote on in Virginia is Attorney General. And much like the U.S. Attorney General, they are Virginia's so-called top cop. They're the top investigator and basically what Bill Barr and the U.S. Attorney is to the Department of Justice, the Attorney General is to Virginia's crime-fighting agencies. State treasurer, utilities, again, a lot of these, there's going to be minor variations from state to state. All states, and this is important, has a judiciary system. Now remember our old friend, the Articles of Confederation. It allowed the colonies, states, to set up their own court systems, but they did not account for a federal court system. So if you went through the Virginia court system and lost, that was it. Nowhere else to appeal your case. Well, the Constitution, of course, took care of that with creating the federal judiciary, but there is still a robust state system. And there are always jurisdictional questions. Is this a state issue or a federal court issue? If it's a state issue, it goes to the state court system. Much like we got different tiers with the federal court system, we have different tiers in the state. Each district, and these right here show you the districts of Virginia. We're in the 19th here. In the 19th district, you can have 3 local courts. There is juvenile and domestic relations, self-explanatory. There's general district, which is for civil and non-criminal activity. Circuit court is for criminal and big claims civil cases. General and juvenile and general court, general district, you can appeal to circuit court. Circuit court, you can't appeal the other ways. If you want to go from beyond circuit court, you go to a state appeals court. And so you can see a lot of the parallels between this and the U.S. justice system. It's not an accident. The U.S. justice system, in terms of organization, works well enough to where most all the states copy that. There's very little variation, really, in the various judicial systems within all of our 50 states. Finally, one of the increasingly big roles of the state is marketing, economic development, tourism. This is money. This is what makes a state grow. People investing money, people moving to your state, spending money at your restaurants and hotels, using your services. That's how a garden grows. That's how a state grows. Again, states have in Virginia, we're no different. They have entire agencies that work around the clock to try to get businesses to come here, to get existing businesses to expand, to assist existing businesses who are in danger of laying off people. They're trying to keep as many people gainfully employed in their state as possible. And because the nature of employment has changed, that has become a very, very, very competitive industry. We used to measure economic development by big, large factories that opened. Local example, Dan River Mills, Danville, one time employed 12,000 people. That is about 1 out of every 4 persons in Danville worked at the mill. So if you lived in Danville, you either worked at the mill or knew a whole bunch of people who did. And in charge of 1/4 of the economy, yeah, that's big. The way we measured economic development from that point on is industrial employment, manufacturing, making goods. How much do you need? Well, technology takes away a lot of that. You can do the same amount of work or more, you can get the same amount of production or even more production with a lot less manpower. So businesses need fewer employees in order to turn that profit. Well, these people still have to work. A state is trying to get as many industries, not just industries, but small businesses as possible to open. But other states are doing it too. So there are legendary battles right now that books are being written about states competing for large employers. About 10 years ago, Volvo announced they were looking for a new North American factory, and they were ready to invest heavily. Well, Alabama, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, Tennessee, Kentucky, basically every state in old Dixie knew that they were interested in the southeastern United States. And there have been a couple of long articles and books written about the competition for this business. South Carolina got it, if you're wondering. But it was sort of the epitome of states battling states for these precious, precious jobs, which make your job as a state official paying the bills all the more possible. States, of course, like the U.S., has regulations on businesses. They all the time have to weigh, okay, are our regulations a little too onerous? Are they not attracting people? But if we get them too low, then we're not protecting the people necessarily enough. It's always going to be that balancing act. We will always debate that. We will also debate the phenomenon of government simply putting forth money as an incentive. That happens all the time. If Virginia and North Carolina are competing for super duper factory. And North Carolina is offering $2.5 million in tax breaks and a $3 million upfront payment. If Virginia's not offering that, they're going to go to North Carolina. Now, of course, there comes a point where the money you offer makes the business not worth it. Where is that? Is it $5 million? Is it $10 million? If we give them $50 million, we're probably going to get them. But we just gave them $50 million. Are they going to do $50 million worth of good? Again, these debates are all done at the state level in particular. And it is now, again, because we are trying to get as many employers as possible. One of the main functions of a state is to make their state as attractive to new development as possible. Travel and tourism, same thing. In some cases, even more so, because tourism is what's called clean economic development. It is to say people come in, they spend a lot of money, and they leave. You don't have to provide schools for them. You don't have to provide roads for them. You don't have to provide long-term services. They just come, dump their money, and leave. So you can see why tourism is a very coveted industry. Oh yeah, casino, Danville, 1,300 jobs. That's big. That is big. But suffice to say, that is, as we go along, that's one of the increasing functions of a state government, is making their state as attractive as possible for businesses. I promised this would not be as long this week, and I was right. Again, no thorny constitutional amendments to get me all fired up and whatnot. As you can see, state government really parallels the federal government, except in the obvious ways. Lower scope, of course, of authority being the biggest. But this model of government that the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, created for the federal government is pretty darn good. All 50 state governments mirror it to some degree. Yes, there are some things they're required to do. They're required to have a constitution, a governor, a legislature, and all that. And yes, they are all ultimately subservient to federal law and the U.S. Constitution. But all 50 of the states, in terms of the way they operate, very closely mirror the federal government. That tells me the way we've got it set up is not too shabby right now. Anyway, next week we're going to get even closer to home as we talk about local government. I'll be talking about the governments that I know best, Danville and Pittsylvania County. I've been involved in both of them for 35 years. I think I can give you a little insight. Also, not on the video here, but I can tell you some nasty little secrets too, only we'll know. They won't be on the test. Folks, enjoy your weekend. We will see you on Monday.